Good afternoon, good day, good morning, good evening from where you're joining us around the world. My name is Kaya Koko. I am the head of investigations at the Mail and Guardian publication Africa's Better Future. Welcome to Good Governance Africa in partnership with Botswana Watch's webinar, uh, Botswana's Democracy and the Diamond Dilemma. It's the 28th of October, Monday, 2024. In 2 days' time, on the 30th of October, Botswana, often referred to as Africa's longest standing democracy, goes to the polls again, where President Mokgweetsi Masisi will be seeking his second 5-year term after doing reasonably well at the 2019 polls. I am not alone. I am joined by a panel of experts, Dr. Unalena Silulwane, who is a leading expert in democracy and governance, as well as sustainable development in Southern Africa. I have also got Me Sheila Khama, who is a very respected resources and mining director in Botswana, listed or as a non-executive director of many listed companies, industry expert for many works for many multinational companies, and of course, last but not least, Dr. Ross Harvey, who is a director at Good Governance Africa, specializing in natural resources and sustainable development in the African continent. I guess we'll start with you, Dr. Silulwane. Going into the polls on Wednesday, major shake-up over the last 5 years. As widely reported, there's been a major fallout within the Botswana Democratic Party, with former President Ian Khama falling out with current President Masisi. Former President Khama was in a self-imposed exile in South Africa for about 3 years since November 2021, recently returned to his home country in September under a cloud of corruption charges, about 14 charges, not corruption, but criminal charges, possession unlawful firearm, possession of stolen property, raft of other allegations that he calls politically motivated, since he's falling out with a man who used to be close with the current president. With and we can see there's also been an Afrobarometer study that came out this year that showed that about 8 in 10 Botswana believe that there's a bit of corruption and nepotism within the presidency. So that whole good story surrounding Botswana, which has always been a beacon of transparency and good governance in Africa, has seemingly waned over the last 5 years. Going into these elections, Dr. Silulwane, how do you see Botswana standing, and whether the last 5 years could be a threat to the democracy that's flourished since independence in 1966?
The BDP didn't just fall out 5 years ago. Under the presidency of Kgosi Ian Khama, the BDP first experienced a major split because of how the party was being run at the time. This was unprecedented because historically, party splits, acrimonious party splits, were historically associated with oppositional politics. The ruling party seemed to be rocking on a steady boat until you had an army general, a former army general for presidency, and at the same time bringing in an institution that had been in the pipeline, but which came to fruition under his presidency, which was led by, you had a former army general bringing in literally his army into office, into public office as civilians. And these were guys who were not really trained on being civilians and recognizing other than the power of their former commandant. And so we began a reign that was terrifying, those 10 years, where the institution that was supposed to be an intelligence institution providing information to the head of state was seen to be preying on citizens in order to facilitate the incumbency of the new president. So that is where the splits started happening within the ruling party and have basically continued. But we need to look deeper into what is happening politically, because you cannot discuss democracy and democratic rule and rule of law without looking also at the underlying currents of where the citizens, the voters, are, because citizens who don't hold their governments to account, you cannot have a thriving democracy that way. It's about being able to demand accountability without fear. And the ushering in of the admin of Lieutenant Ian Khamas Rezakama was marked by the first time that we saw the state publicly executing civilians. And it left everybody terrified. Members of parliament have been terrified of the power of the intelligence unit. The change of guard notwithstanding, it has been seen as a rogue agency that terrifies the people and has no respect for the rule of law or for democracy, or even for that matter, the Constitution. So we do have a problem with that particular institution, and it doesn't look like there is ever going to be a brotherhood between the former president and the men he handed the baton on to, which speaks volumes about the weakness of our system in terms of ushering in the next president, that one person decides who will take over from him, for better or for worse. And so far, since Mahaye, there has been regret on the part of the two men who have handed over to the next president, that maybe it was unwise. That is why it must be done democratically, not be a decision by one man. So that's where we are at with that one.
And it's a very interesting context. And as I said earlier on, Botswana has been known to be very stable. You referenced the former president Festus Mogae and how stable the Botswana government has been, and ever since of late, the falling out within the BDP. We know that former President Khama has gone into into opposition and backed an opposition party for the last elections. I wonder about the economic implications thereof, and maybe bring in Sheila Khama there in terms of business, because there's been a very good relationship between diamond mining companies and Botswana. Diamond, obviously, accounting for about between 80 to 90% of the country's exports. Botswana rated as a high middle income country, although it has a significantly high unemployment at over 25, 27% or so. It's done very well economically. Of late, the World Bank recently saying it's looking at economic growth at just over 1%, down from about 2.7% last year, 2023, significantly down from 5.5% it reached in 2022. So I'm wondering, Meshila, whether the political strife that has happened since the falling out within the main governing party, the BDP, has had an effect on the economic outlook of Botswana and Botswana in general. I know there's also been a slow demand within diamonds, and Botswana has been trying to diversify its economy away from the resource. But are the political is the political wrangling also having an effect on how the public sector deals with the private sector? As someone within the private sector.
I'm not a macroeconomist, so I can't speak to economic policy per se, but I'm quite comfortable to speak to impact on the capacity to attract investment and what happens when there's political fracture. Uh, and I think that we should probably look at it from two levels. One, I think we should look at it from the impact on current business, ongoing business, which in mining terms would largely mean uh, the diamond industry and relations with the BS, and then of course other minerals that are being mined, albeit in smaller quantities. I think it's also important to then say the relationship between the government of Botswana and the BS is beyond any political party per se, and that assumes they stick to the law. If they are roguish, then of course anything is possible. But I think I can say with some degree of certainty that if you look at Botswana's constitution, and then you look at the Botswana's mineral law, including the one that has just been introduced as a draft bill to be considered, nothing seems to change. That would make DBS worry. But more importantly, it's important to realize that as far as mining companies are concerned, the single most important thing when they think about potential political turmoil is instability of the rights that they have to minerals. So to be clear, in Botswana, the company that has rights to the minerals is not BS, it is Botswana. The laws of Botswana granted BS the rights in two steps. One, the right to negotiate access, and then the obligation to form a company with the government, which it was formed in 69 and is called Botswana. So for the BS to lose his rights, Botswana would have to be dissolved, and the concept and the laws that create Botswana would have to change. So it's important always to distinguish that. Where DBS might be vulnerable is in the commercial space, where the government every 10 years since 2011, previous to that it was 5, negotiates the right to sell. Here the government, based on either a law or capacity to negotiate, can progressively erode the value, as we have seen, that goes to DBS. But that's just a negotiation. It has no political undertones, except for why the government does that and what the government does with its shares. That can be political, which is, for instance, set up a state-owned entity, and then you can turn that into a genuine force for good, or it can just be something that the government of the day uses it to itself. That historians will have to observe and write later. So I see in the diamond space nothing really that ought to worry DBS or change. I see, however, an undue politicization of natural resources. This is a bad thing to do, because what it does is that it takes what is really an economic asset and turns it into political capital, albeit undermining the economic value that should accrue to the country in the process, because you either run the mining sector properly and sustainably using all the necessary sustainable development concepts of intergenerational value and governance concepts, in which case the assumption is that the country is better off. If you turn it into political capital, then it becomes an asset for the few who have the access of public institutions to use different mechanisms to then benefit the political elite. My sense is that if there is anything we should worry about, it is that prospect. And it is not that somehow the BS is threatened. No. I think, as a citizen, it is the prospect that we take an economic asset, politicize it, all the while, like we did with land in Zimbabwe. We talk about it. It fires up the electorate because they believe they're going to be better off when you dispossess former colonialists of land. But actually, 40 years later, they're still waiting. It would be a travesty if this is what happened in Botswana. I worry about the governance issue, and by this I mean, for the longest time, not only Botswana was considered fairly well-run democratically, year on year, whether it was Transparency International, whether it was the Fraser's Institute in Canada, Botswana bubbled to the top of her African counterparts in terms of an environment that was friendly. It could well be a fluke. We have to wait and see. But we had a case recently of a Canadian junior that made a copper discovery, obliged Botswana's laws to the latter. And yet, when the time came for them to be granted the right to develop the project, the government just balked for no apparent reason, to the point that the Canadian junior had to take them to court, wherein a Botswana judge said, on face value, there's nothing here. This matter should never have come to me. Give the company its license. Now, that's bad enough, if you ask me. If you are the watchdog and the judiciary in your country that you appointed says to you, say you're out of line, you should worry. And you made a mistake, the technocrats will advise you, fine. Now consider this. Instead of our government granting the license, as our judges that we appointed had said, we didn't. The Canadian junior had to go back to the judge and ask the judge to imprison our minister. And it was only then that we gave them a license our laws had said they had a right to. That should worry us. Now, here's the funny thing. When the judge said, give them the license the first time, you know what the Canadians said? They celebrated. They said, we love this country. Here, democracy rules, rule of law. And we stood up and said, no, you are wrong. We don't respect the rule of law. Who does that to themselves? So if you ask me, it is this appearance of indifference towards our own laws, a brazen attitude in which we do as we want, not as our laws say. I think that more than what happens or doesn't happen to the BS is what worries me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sheila, and that's very comprehensive. In fact, it brings us to you, Dr. Harvey, regarding the political economy. How the politicization, as Ms. Sheila Khama spoke about, of natural resources. Where can we, what effects have that happened? Ms. Sheila referenced Zimbabwe earlier, bringing it to Botswana. and its efforts to diversify its economy. We saw earlier this year that the president banned certain imports from South Africa, looking to strengthen its agricultural sector. Just talk us through, Dr. Harvey, that the politics and economy and Botswana's efforts to diversify its industries.
Sure. Thanks, Kaya. And yeah, as you'll have heard from the previous two speakers, very eloquently describing the political economy trajectory over the last 10 to 15 years, it certainly has been of concern to those who watch the country. And to use the horribly overused cliche, we might say that in many respects, and certainly in terms of how we think about political economy, Botswana has lost some of its shine. And it speaks very much to what Mashila just referenced, and that is that if you consider the elite bargain, the nature of the relationship between political and business elites in any country, what you hope for, at least as an external political economy analyst, is to see a reduction in the proclivity for personalized deal making, and you want to see transparent, relatively impersonal lines of exchange within the economy that are not politically interfered with. And unfortunately, over the last 10 years, certainly maybe even over the last 15 years, we have seen a reduction in Botswana's rule of law score, for instance. So from the World Bank data, whatever one might say about the veracity of that data, one of the few measures that we do have of control of corruption, Botswana has dropped in score from 71.6% in 2014 down to 66% now, and that's still significantly higher than the regional average, but it is of concern. And of course, the issue isn't always how a country performs relative to its neighbors. It's about how it performs over time. And that trend seems to be downwards. Government effectiveness, Botswana still scores very high at 76.89%, but citizen voice and accountability has also declined, and there Botswana is sitting at 66.67%, which speaks to the point that Dr. Serafani made earlier. And having said all of that, the issue is that we're concerned that under conditions of personalized deal making, that what has historically served the country will increasingly start to serve only elite interests. And when you see a political and business elite starting to pursue what we might call a ZANU-PF playbook, it is extremely concerning. And as Sheila eloquently pointed out, when those at the top, if you like, of the political elite rubbish decisions made by a still independent judiciary or give the appearance of indifference towards them, then rating agencies and external observers definitely start to get nervous. The reason it's particularly nerve-wracking is that Botswana's economy has struggled to diversify away from a dependence on diamonds. It has made great strides in respect of local beneficiation that was cleverly and carefully thought through, and it's provided opportunity which certainly could benefit future generations. But of course, a country can't rely forever on a finite resource. And so it is important, as diamond rents start to decline, that the country start thinking very seriously about establishing future opportunities for labor absorptive growth. Because as you referenced earlier, Kaya, Botswana does suffer higher unemployment rates, not nearly as high as South Africa, and having had a really productive, fruitful diamond-driven economy. Its GDP per capita in 2023 was $17,471 US. Now that's 4 times the sub-Saharan African average, excluding high-income countries. And the GDP per person employed is $52,279, which is really significant versus the regional average of $12,017. Now, what a country needs to do when it does have what we call a resource windfall that Botswana's had since 1966 is to invest that capital in the ability to allow growth in non-resource sectors. Now, that sometimes proves quite difficult to do because of the way in which the extractive industries can literally extract resources away from manufacturing sectors, and the appreciation of the currency can render the tradable sector exports less competitive. But nonetheless, Botswana has had and continues to have an opportunity to invest in what we call human and physical infrastructure to generate growth opportunities for the future. And certainly this is the case in areas like tourism. And Kaya, to answer your question specifically, imposing tariffs on imports from any country is always a tricky conundrum. You know, we've got to move across the continent towards an African continental free trade area where we're really trying to improve intra-regional trade, and the imposition of tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers like corruption of border posts and whatever, it always bodes badly. The continent really needs us to engage one another trade-wise in respect of dynamic comparative advantage. What I don't mean by that is we shouldn't always be stuck in exporting kind of high bulk, low value products, but we really should try and build up industries in which we have a relative comparative advantage and trade on those grounds. And it seems to me that for all the noise in 2019 that Botswana was open to business and would become more open and more tax friendly to investors and so on, we haven't seen that materialize. And I think that is causing many external analysts to become a little bit concerned. And again, it's exactly right. I think what Sheila said, that political fracturing and the uncertainty that creates does bode poorly for investment. Now, that doesn't necessarily show up in your data because you can't really measure what was forgone, but you really feel it when it is forgone. And so, yeah, I think that from an external political economy perspective, I sit in Cape Town. I was born in Botswana. I haven't lived in the daily warp and woof of Botswana's political economy. But looking in from the outside, it does seem to be of concern.
Yeah, and following on from what seems to be a bigger control from the presidency over trying to the economic outlook, also the intelligence services, as Dr. Silulwane mentioned. When we opened control over the media. Maybe I can bring you back in, Dr. Silulwane, because you mentioned something very interesting earlier about how there's no pushback from civil society, or what seems like there's no pushback from civil society towards the greater control by the presidency or the political elite over intelligence services, over media. Dr. Harvey just referenced tariff conditions there. But you look at a voter turnout, for example. I mean, that's only just one marker of democratic participation, but Botswana has a very high voter turnout, So in and amongst all of that, about 84% of registered voters do turn up to the polls, which is a very, very impressive, considering in South Africa, we're only about at 60% and dropping. So just Dr. Silulwane, if you can explain what you had meant earlier about the lack of civil society pushback to some of the controls that the political elite are having in Botswana.
Maybe a corrective there. I did say we began to see that decline towards authoritarianism during the Khama regime, but civil society has played a very, very important role in the evolution of Botswana's democratic and political space. The trade unions have flexed their muscles after, legal constraints that made it very difficult for trade unions to, in fact, organize effectively. Even though Botswana had a tripartite system, as a nod to the ILO, in fact, it was mainly a marriage between the government of the day and the business sector, with a very, very disabled labor representation in the tripartite system. But you look at the role that women's struggle for representation, the role that youth, these things are always dynamic. One area of discourse happens, and it sets an example that in a democracy, it is the right of citizens as individuals as well as in their collectives to demand accountability from the state, to demand voice. And in that, we actually did see both the growth of the trade unions in Botswana in terms of their ability to flex their muscles and make demands. We also saw the media fraternity also growing in terms of voice. When you look at our private newspapers, from the beginning when they started off in a state-dominated arena, you see nothing but growth in terms of ability to articulate, to question, to embarrass, and to give people voice. So the youth also came in and worked within their own parties. The reason that the ruling party now has limited term for presidency is because you had women demanding their share of participation. You had youth saying, we also need to be there, enforcing within their own parties, because there was very, very little democracy across all our parties internally. And so it had to be groups of citizens saying, we demand a voice, we demand to be represented. Similarly with ethnic groups saying, the minority groups saying, we demand to be seen, to be heard. We are here. It's not just the dominant ethnic groups that are hogging the limelight and basically making policies and laws that benefit them to our exclusion. And so you've had all these organizations demanding accountability. But since the advent of this organization that is supposed to be providing intelligence, people have been intimidated. So that has played a role. Even opposition parties worry that the DIS will walk in, grab their computers for no reason at all. And so you look, the UDC, as far as I'm aware, has now opened office in South Africa because they did not want their computers taken over by an organization that sees itself basically as the ruler of everybody, above the law, as the former director of DIS has actually articulated that as director of that institution, he is above the law. He is above the president. He is above the constitution. That's essentially how these soldiers see. They are used to having a commandant saying, this is how you do things. They don't question, they obey. the idea of respecting and obeying the Constitution before the commandant is not how soldiers are trained. And so that has eroded somewhat the freedoms that Botswana were building through organizational activity. So no, Botswana are not silent. And now, with the advent of the social media, government no longer has monopoly on voice, on media voice. People go onto social media to express themselves, to mobilize others, so that they are beyond access. Of course, some rogue elements in DIS, and we don't know whether it is also suiting for those in incumbency to look the other way. But the thing that Sheila raised about individuals who are holding power, totally disrespecting the rule of law. We are seeing those trends now, beginning with the Ian Khama administration. But I must say, even he, except for unleashing the DIS on people, even he realized that, you can test how far, you can push the law without necessarily always disrespecting the law fundamentally. That has gotten worse. We had thought that with the new regime, at least we'll go back to the respect of the Constitution and the rule of law. Our president articulates how much he's in love with the rule of law. But the interference that we see, an example being how the Baliti, Khosi, the female chief of the Baliti, who actually have title deed over their tribal land. They took that in colonial times. But for a leader, a traditional leader, to be called to State House and actually told that she should toe the line when she has taken, she had taken her grievance to the court. What happens is that social media also gives us access. A state president makes a public statement which is captured by social media, and tomorrow he says, no, I never said that, even when you play those things. So these are the things that have eroded confidence in our institutions. But yeah, there has been a pushback from all areas of life, organized interest, as well as the opposition political parties. But we also have to appreciate one thing. Botswana's democracy, Botswana's democratic rule was when the state earned its right to be legitimate in the first 2-3 decades of its existence. It earned that fair and square, the confidence that Botswana put on the state and in the institutions of the state and the division of power. That is eroding because of the tendency now for incumbent presidents and ministers to personalize procedures that rightfully belong to different arms of the state. Now, you personalize that, then it's everybody for himself and God for us all. We have seen that it is dangerous. Even Ian Khama, when he removed the barriers that restricted public servants from doing private business with government, because they could always award themselves or their spouses or their children government tenders. The minute that was removed by state directive, it happened, but fortunately for Botswana, the law was not tampered with. The law is still there, but Botswana respect their leaders to a point where when a directive is given, we no longer have those that will say that is legally incorrect. So we have people who fear the presidency, who fear incumbency, and do not respect the law. And that has been very consistent in the last 15 years.
I wonder. Sorry about that, Dr. Silulwana. I wonder, just to follow up on what you're saying, on how then, because you referenced the UDC earlier, and for our viewers who don't know, it's the Umbrella for Democratic Change, a group of opposition parties currently holding about 15 seats in the 65-seat National Assembly. So going into Wednesday's elections, 30 October elections, Dr. Silulwane, with you saying that the UDC, the Umbrella for Democratic Change, has had to open offices in South Africa, what are the chances of once the results have been declared? I mean, we saw recently in Mozambique, it took about an age for the results to come back, and the Electoral Commission in Mozambique finally, a couple of days ago, announced that Dan Chapo from Frelimo had received 70% of the votes. However, there's a lot of contestations there. A lot of opposition parties citing what you were saying, that there was major interference by the securocrats, agencies like the DIS, or its equivalent in Mozambique. So how is it possible then for opposition parties to campaign well, or have they campaigned well leading up to Wednesday's elections? And what are their prospects of maybe increasing their seat allocation from the current 15 that they have of the 65-seater? And when the results are declared, everyone accepting them as being free and fair?
Let me point out one thing. You see, the disrespect for the law has not reached levels where people would outright just say, no, I haven't lost, let me hand over. We haven't reached that. But we have seen something that has been very worrying. This is the first time in Botswana's electoral history where everybody was late, I mean political parties, in coming out and seeking electoral support. And from what we can see analytically, because of the very conflict within the ruling party that you have observed, the uncertainty there of who is with the incumbent and who is with the former president. And then, of course, there's the third party who is supporting oppositional parties when the former president is already deeply involved in opposition politics. You see a situation where we now have a very, very important basis of Botswana law, our constitution, the attempt to hijack it, because the numbers have been very consistent. The ruling party has been losing the popular vote. It was expected that by 1999 we would have a change of government. It didn't happen because the opposition split. But the numbers are decreasing very clearly. And as they decrease, the attempt to increase its own capacity to function in a possible minority position has been increasing. And it isn't just with the current regime, it goes back a little. But here it is, where the constitution is being rushed through and everything is postponed in order for the ruling party to increase the number of people that it would elect specially. The BDP has always been able to use that, frankly, to increase its presence when its popularity has waned. It has always gerrymandered in terms of how it sets up political voting, diluting constituencies that are too favorable to the opposition. It happens, I'm sure, everywhere in the world. That gerrymandering, how you twist and ensure that you actually get. But you see, we're talking about a population that is very youthful, that has become a voting public. The demography of things are such that it doesn't matter how you try to square a circle. Eventually, you have to deal with the fact that you are no longer popular. And so the constitution being changed with a little bit of this and that, as if, it is to our collective benefit, is what has led to everybody going to knock on our doors very late. So you want to come in?
Yes, Dr. Silulwane. And it's very interesting what you're saying in terms of some of the challenges the opposition parties have been enduring. And I'd like to bring in Professor Emmanuel Butlale into the conversation. Dr. Emmanuel Butlale is a professor of public finance and governance, specializing in public sector management and economic development in Botswana. He is slightly late, Professor Butlale, not through no fault of his own. Some technical connectivity issues there prevented Professor Butlale from starting with us. And I'd like to go on to just to recap, Professor Butlale, we've been discussing how you've caught the last bit of it, Dr. Silulwane, eloquently stating that support for the governing BDP has been waning of late. There's the DIS and some problems with the DIS in terms of how it is trying to stymie democratic participation in civil society work within Botswana, but Botswana are fighting back through the use of very progressive trade unions, a strong civil society, the advent of social media also helping Botswana push back against some of the issues of government, some of the governing issues that have come on, as Dr. Silulwane and Meshile Khama spoke about, began at the start of former President Ian Khama's presidency. It's been a fallout, obviously public fallout between the former president and current President Mokgweetsi Masisi. And I've been wondering, in terms of public finance, Professor Butlale, how has the Botswana government managed its fiscal responsibilities, owing, obviously, if you look at declining diamond export revenues because of slow international demand, low productivity of late, forecast of 1% GDP growth, down significantly from a nice high of 5.5% in 2022, 2.7 in 23, looking at 1% this year. What will be the challenges for public finance management of the Botswana fiscus by the government over the last 5 years, obviously, but looking ahead post the 30 October elections?
Yeah, thank you. My apologies for the IT challenges that I had, I managed to get back into the meeting. No, no, that's a very interesting question because lately, there's been some conversation around the fiscals to say what really is happening. Typically, when you go on social media, there are a lot of posts. A government department will be saying this. Let's do some belt tightening. Let's do this. Let's do that. Some parastatal will be having same. So certainly, there's a sense of unease about what is happening, particularly because in August somewhere there was issues relating to the depleted government investment accounts to say.
Prof, sorry to cut you, Prof. Could you please just tilt your screen slightly so that we can see? We're only catching a glimpse of your forehead at the and there we go. All right. Yeah, then we can see you perfectly now. You may carry on,
Okay.
sir.
Yeah. Sorry about that. No, I was saying that particularly in August, there was issue about the government investment account, the GIA, actually being almost depleted, and of course, the Minister of Finance gave the nation an update in terms of the state of the GIA and as to what led to that, and that of course they were saying there are efforts to replenish it. So I think all in all, we are sitting at a very dangerous fiscal space because already you can see that mega projects are being scaled down. Departments, ministries are asked to reprioritize and really tighten their belts and stuff like that. So meaning that really going forward, you would expect more transparency in terms of what's really happening, because there's a lot of speculation to say, is government technically broke? At least that is what people are thinking, but it is not coming out clear. At least from the government side, what is the real state of the economy? Yeah, they are talking in generalities, but in specifics, you don't know really what is happening. You ask yourself, do we go forward? Will government be able to do basic things? Will it be able to pay salaries? Will it be able to pay money for scholarships and stuff like this? So this is really something that I don't think there's a lot of transparency around it. So we are at a point whereby the nation is we are asking questions, but no answers are really coming forth. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. And just a follow up on that, you mentioned, because it's very well known, certainly to some of us here in South Africa, to make it personal, some of us grew up at schools where we had a lot of students from Botswana coming into South Africa and being subsidized by the state of Botswana to come and study high school, into tertiary, and so on and so forth. So with, as you're saying, the belt tightening that you're speaking of, things like public service, the community service that is offered in Botswana. How are the prospects looking, sustainability-wise, going into the next 5 years of those very progressive policies of educating state-funded education of Botswana and their children, as well as community service and all of those things? What prospects are we looking at? Do you think they'll be phased out or scaled back in terms of funding? And is there room to maneuver, especially if diamond prices, which have fallen, I think, by 2.7% over the last month, don't increase and increase revenue into the Botswana fiscus? What space would the government have to execute its programs?
Yeah, thank you. I see it here as a proud product of public education, free all the way to PhD. During our time in the early 2000s, when we came to university, they simply asked you, where do you want to go to school? Do you want to go to the Americas, Australia, the UK, or some other place? And I remember one time when I was in New York doing my PhD, and I was telling this student that I'm on a full scholarship. I don't have to pay back any cent. They're asking me, is government your mother, your father? I said, no, I'm actually just having my share of the diamonds. This is a true story. So now, that was like 20, 25 years ago. And now I look at my children, in terms of what they will benefit. And of course, education, of course, with health, these are, at least they've been generously funded. But let me just focus on education. Yes, you find that what you just needed to do was to get the number of, just qualify, and then the government will send you to school. But now, things are really so tough. It's like that particularly in terms of higher education financing, sponsorships are really tough to come by. And now there's now talk of cost recovery and cost sharing. So meaning that at the minimum now they're talking about cost sharing. Let's just share this cost. That is it. But of course now they're going beyond cost recovery, cost sharing to say, now let's talk cost recovery. So we advance you money and then you gotta pay it back. So this is really a different landscape compared to what we had 20 years ago, 25 years ago when I was a student in the US. So yes, it's really dim. The future is dim. So what you are going to see is that what was previously classified as public goods, like education, is going to be redefined now as a private good. It's like that you see this radical shift where learners, parents are being asked to come to the party to say that, guys, there's no money, so you need to help us with this. So like I'm saying, you're going to see this big shift, at least in education, from a public good to a private good. Thank you.
It's very grim, Professor Butlale. Maybe if I can bring in Mayor Sheila. We'll come to you, Dr. Sololwane. I just want to bring in Mayor Sheila quickly, Mayor Sheila Khama, because obviously Botswana is still largely resource dependent. And, with Professor Butlale mentioning that grim outlook in terms of less funding for public good, such as education, which he benefited from, and many people, some I know personally, friends of mine, benefited from. How can, and I know you're not a macroeconomic expert, but speaking from an investment and an industry insider in the extractive industries, how do you feel that they could be better managed by the incoming government post 30 October, so that more Botswana can benefit and we avoid what Professor Butlale so grimly outlined?
I think context matters, and I think it's important. First, I think it's important just to recognize two things. The first is that on matters of extractives, mineral oil and gas, there are two absolute certainties that are an non-brainer. The fact is that from the moment you pump that first barrel of oil, the resource is depleting. If you produce diamonds, from the moment you lift the first carat, you are going downstream. That is not a rocket science. And so governments that are astute manage revenue from mineral oil and gas with this fundamental understanding that it is God's or nature's windfall. The second thing is that if you live off revenue from selling mineral oil and gas, that you can be certain that the price based on demand will often go up and then often go down. And governments that are astute using principles of public revenue management and fiscal policy operate on the principles that you spend on average less than what you get, such that if and when the revenue declines, the balance that you didn't spend, you use, but you always do assume that there will be a downturn. So the governments that operate in a space in which 1 month we award our Minister of Finance a prize for excellence, and then have her tell us a month later we are broke. Look, Joe, it doesn't sound right. Based on how you move from 1 week from being and manage a steward sustainably of our resources to us being broke in a world in which sustainable development is very clear, it speaks to the ability to manage your natural resources such that you protect intergenerational value. We are not even in the next generation. This is underperformance, colossal underperformance. Having said that, we also have to be honest and say, of course, my generation, his and Du's generation, were the lucky ones. Botswana started off with a population of 380,000. At 240, you are not going to be the same unless you're growing the pie. So Botswana's problem is not just that revenue is diminishing. It is that in perpetuity we have depended on one source and we have not succeeded. And you could argue we tried and failed, but that's a fact. And so even with the best will in the world, between population growth, between unemployment, between a diminishing resource, we are always flying into a storm. How did we not see this? This, I think, is the real question we should ask ourselves. It's a failing on the part of those responsible for the resources not to have perceived this. But there's a bigger problem, as far as I see. You see, we can talk as citizens about the diamond, the copper, the coal as being ours, because the Constitution says so. The laws then say, if you win at the elections, you will form a government and you will then be the agent for managing these resources for citizens. You get that power, and government after government, our government does not disclose its agreements with mining companies. My agent has disempowered me, put another way. This is not good, because perhaps if there was more disclosure and more public awareness, we wouldn't have all been taken by surprise. As a matter of fact, if we had been, for instance, part of international organizations like EIT, you would have had civil society looking into this. But to Dr. Solana's point, this tendency to hog and centralize power to the level where my fiduciary is now excluding my voice. Not just excluding my voice, but excluding Parliament, whom I have elected so they represent me. They too don't have sight of the agreements. In democratic terms, in governance terms based on transparency, accountability, and public participation, in the space of management of revenue from minerals, sharing of information on agreements, the government of Botswana for 50 years falls short. And I think that a part of where we are now has to do with that. Our ability to particularly, and we are vulnerable because as a country, we trade at the top two things, and they're both luxury items. It is high-end tourism and diamonds. People will trade with us because we smell of roses. People will not trade with us because we don't smell of roses. So no country is more vulnerable to the absence or the appearance of the absence of transparency, good governance, and using minerals for public good. If we fail to do that, we will not be able to do business with the rest of the world because of the nature of the products that we trade. And so it's not just the right thing to do, it's the necessary economic thing to do if we are going to increase the fiscal receipts and sustain them. That's what I thought I might contribute, albeit not directly answering. I apologize. I'm a grandma. I reserve to ask myself my questions.
No, thanks, Neshila Khama. And maybe just bring you in, Dr. Uh, Ross Harvey, before we go back to Dr. Selulwane. Um, uh, in terms of your research, Dr. Ross Harvey, I mean, you and I in South Africa, we know that for a few years, about 10 or so years ago, there was the Fees Must Fall campaign, and that related directly to diminishing public finance in order to fund things like free education at a tertiary level. A lot of it had to do with a lot of corruption within our state entity, the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, to help students and so on and so forth. Following on from the contributions of Shila Khama and Professor Bukhali, um, the correlation between adequate public policy and the utilization of Africa's vast mineral and natural resources that lead to diminishing. I mean, what sort of unrest? I know there hasn't been any unrest, and fingers crossed there isn't in Botswana. But if governments don't find that balance right in your research on the African continent, sustainability wise, that how has that translated into tensions between the citizenry and the state machinery?
Yeah, Kaya, great question. I'll say two things. So one, it's quite clear from our research, especially if you look just at our governance performance index, which at this stage only measures local government performance in respect of their core constitutional mandate, which is to deliver services. We find a strong correlation between improved governance performance and political stability. Botswana still performs extremely well in respect of political stability. If you look at the World Bank data, the World Governance Indicators, for instance, political stability is still strong in Botswana. However, you do see the trend very clearly in the numbers that as governance performance starts to decline, that citizens become more and more irate. And in a well-established democracy, typically the initial line of response is, as has already been articulated by Dr. Selukwane, the media voice starts to become stronger, labor unions step up to the plate, and we have started to see this. I was just using the front page of The Guardian, for instance, in Botswana this morning, and it is clear that the media are starting to exercise much more of a voice than I saw when I initially started looking at Botswana's political economy just over 10 years ago. So there are promising signs of engagement. It's also interesting to consider a chapter written in 2004 by Darren Asimoglu and James Robinson, who've recently won the Nobel Prize in economics, and they really commended Botswana for its institutional performance. In other words, the social systems, cultures, beliefs, norms, and values that motivate regular human behavior. Those social systems, those institutions that generate the incentives by which the public and private sector perform were relatively strong in Botswana, at least relative to its African peers. But as Sheila and Prof. Botlalo have rightly pointed out, the ability to transparently and sustainably manage the wealth generated by diamonds hasn't been, I think, as proficient as it should or could have been. And now it's always unfair to draw parallels with places like Norway. You know, they have a very different history, a very different set of inherited institutions and so forth. But what we have seen there is that the exploitation of a finite resource, oil, has resulted in a sovereign wealth fund that has managed to sustain the Norwegian economy into the future. And if you put some of the hypocrisy aside around disinvestment from fossil fuels by that fund and so on, the truth remains that there's something of a model for us to consider replicating to our local context. And so in Botswana, we would have expected, for instance, to see better education outcome, better broad-based education outcomes. We'd have expected to see stronger gross fixed capital formation we'd have expected to see stronger rates of electrification of the rural population. Botswana's access to electricity in rural areas is still only at 30.6%. The average in sub-Saharan Africa, excluding high-income countries, is 30.6%. So Botswana is at 25%. That's at 5 percentage basis points lower than the average, and that's not something we'd have expected to see in a country that's had this much access to wealth, and yes, a growing population, but still a relatively small population. I often say to people that Botswana's population is essentially half the size of the population of Cape Town. And so we would have expected to see stronger performance. And I just in closing, Kaya, I'd say that Sheila is exactly right to say that joining outfits like the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, it's not perfect. There's no supranational body that is, but joining an outfit like the EITI sends a signal to the international community that you are serious about transparency. And it does actually operate in some respects as an FDI, foreign direct investment draw card. And yes, it's not perfect, but it does enable you to marry your local laws to the principles animating the EITI. And I think that would actually serve Botswana very well, because that would enable citizens with the information they require to genuinely hold their governments to account and say, what are you doing with our cash? 25 years ago, we could go and study in the US, no problem. Why is it the case that we can't do that now? Why is it the case that only 25% of the rural population have access to electricity? That this isn't a sufficiently good outcome from the managers of our resources. I'll stop it there for now, Kaya.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Harvey. And just to bring in you, Dr. Selolwane, following on from Dr. Harvey's contributions, I know you had wanted to respond to Professor Botlale's contribution on the declining or fiscal management. As an extension to that, borrowing from what Dr. Harvey just said, how are the socio-political institutions of Botswana, how strong are they to ensure that going into the next medium to long term, that we see a return to when Professor Botlale was still young and be able to study in wherever he wanted to, using the strength of the mineral resources of Botswana. Also, how do we also then, besides those who have access to education, but also in the rural areas, how do we get that electrification up from 25 or 20% to maybe more normal levels? So you can make the contribution you wanted to make earlier in response to Professor Botlale, but just in extension to that, the strength of Botswana as a socio-political institution in ensuring that future generations continue to benefit from its natural and mineral wealth.
Well, a couple of things. You see, Dr. Botlale is talking about 25 years ago. I belong to that generation where we were the first group of young citizens to benefit in large numbers. We set a precedent in terms of children who went to primary school, which we still paid for, and then straight into secondary school, with many of those young people on bursaries. I was one of the unfortunate few that, because my elder sister, who was just 11 years older than me, was working for government, that disqualified me from a government bursary. But we understood that our country didn't have resources. And so those who had a little, let them survive, so that the government could help those with nothing. It wasn't as clean as that, but that was the principle. And so 50 years forward, that has changed. And if you look at the various programs that the government of Botswana has utilized to try and redistribute diamond rents, where it includes infrastructure, the building of roads, when leading to independence, every, I don't know how many kilometers of tarmac that was built, schools closed so that we could go and wave little flags. It was a national celebration that we had a kilometer extra of tarmac. Government has been very good at ensuring. Remember, we ran an open door economy, that we didn't have enough human resources. We didn't have much resources. And so it was like anybody who could come and invest wherever, please come and help us. And we will help ourselves in areas where people from outside were not interested. So we built that ethos that, we would help ourselves. And if you look at our foundational transitional plan, where there was a commitment that the growth of the economy must go hand in hand with the development of people, with the upliftment of people. It is a commitment that was put in there from the word go. And unfortunately for us, as the diamonds begin to roll in the 70s, the ideals of developing Botswana to a point where they become active agents in developing, growing their economy, with government being a policymaker. This is where now you see the diamonds, the discovery of diamonds, as both a curse and a benefit. Because what it meant is that it concentrated so much power, economic power, financial power on the state, that over time, people forgot the principles of ensuring that private agents as Botswana would become economic agents in their own right. So government has been the largest economic agent in Botswana, with citizens just waiting for little handouts by way of jobs, by way of consultancies, by way of handouts. And handouts became the modus operandi of the state, that when you have a problem, you take these diamond rents and you throw them at the problem, and then the problem will go away. The result is that despite the dramatic transformation where Botswana was among the least educationally developed colonial subjects in the British Empire, we have increased at independence. 98% of educational resources were tied to the few primary schools that we had. And government took a decision that they were going to restructure that so that more and more money goes into the development of human resources beyond primary school. That was meant to right-size the preponderance of primary education taking over the lion's share of the little resources. But the success of diamond rents has meant that our civil servants have been reproducing themselves over and over again, looking at excuses to remain in government as bureaucrats, to a point where now what was meant to right-size the preponderance of primary school has in fact led to a drive where this country spends more money on education than most countries in the world. And yet the outcomes of that expenditure are substandard. Our primary schools don't even get a quarter of the share of the educational budget. We are performing lower than the average upper middle income economy in terms of how much of our educational budget goes into primary school and into secondary school. And so you have a few 1% of those going to school actually benefiting from 75%, more than 75% in fact, of the educational budget. So what do you have? You have an economy that produces certificated individuals who want to spend more on getting more certificated individuals with zero skills for the productivity that we require in the economy. And our children starve. Even basics like, what is a primary school child in Botswana eating that's supplied by government, to the quality of food that is provided to a Botswana who is a tertiary school, a tertiary education. It doesn't make sense why a growing 5-year-old should be starved with a starch, while a university student who can work part-time, by the way, then has access to meat, to vegetables, and what have you. It doesn't make sense. We have been called upon, now look, rebalance your educational system so that you actually begin to build skills from primary schools so that when a child graduates from secondary school, they have something to offer the country. When a young person graduates from university, they can hit the ground running by going into industry and serving industry. We don't have that. We have been producing bureaucrats. Our educational system produces bureaucrat after bureaucrat after bureaucrat, getting less and less efficient in managing development because they just want salaries. They want sitting allowances for whatever they have to do for the country. People literally sit for allowances in committees that are supposed to drive rural development. Yes, we may get accolades for building institutions, but those institutions are built to the top quality comparable to other institutions as long as they serve that bit of private sector that is international. That is why our mineral laws, the people we train to go and work in the mines, are trained to the best that is available across the globe. But those who are going to serve in agriculture, to serve in building, in industry, are not given the same level of skill. And hence you find this thing where our kids do not have jobs, but industry requires skills. And who is benefiting? We have to import from Zimbabwe because they come with skills. Ours come with, well, an ID that says, you know, I'm a Botswana, I have rights, but there are no jobs. So when you look at the index of how do all these policies impact the person, the ability of an average Botswana to actually have upliftment, Botswana scores terribly. We may score in financial management and the highest in Africa, I must admit. But when it comes to people, every other African country, the poorest, the middle income, the lower middle income, they beat Botswana hands down. we have not invested enough in generating jobs that do not depend on government handouts. And hence the unpopularity, the trend of disenchantment by young people, no jobs. And so why would they want to vote for anybody, whether it's ruling or aspiring, when they cannot guarantee that, in fact, there will be jobs? And the potential for creating jobs is there. Our civil servants.
If I can bring in Professor Butlale and Selulwane, as we try to wrap up, we are almost out of time there. And just to follow on what Dr. Selulwane said, Professor Butlale, regarding the good financial management that Botswana is renowned for, not just on that African continent, but globally as well. But not seemingly not impacting those at the bottom of the spectrum. Post the 30 October elections, what would you, Professor Butlale, see, or if you say were to be the president, we elect Professor Emmanuel Butlale's party to govern Botswana, what would be, from a public finance management perspective, in order to drive sustainable development, what would be the first things that you think the new government should do in order to ensure that public finances go towards what Dr. Selulwane was speaking to, the people there at the bottom, and not just service or produce bureaucrats who want to live off the state? If you can wrap it up in 2 minutes, Professor Butlale, that will be very appreciated.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Dr. Selulwane, because essentially, when you look at spend, I mean, if you look at per capita expenditure in terms of education, particularly, let's say, at higher education, it's one of the highest in the world, not just in Africa. But then it's education, it's health, whatever it is. But then the most important thing is, what is the efficiency of public spending? That is to say, are we getting maximum value benefit from this expenditure? And the World Bank, the IMF, have told us, over and over again, that we should interrogate the efficiency of public spending. So meaning that we should be aiming for what we call allocative efficiency. So from where I'm sitting, the next government, I would say, public finance management is really key, to running the economy. So what really is, obviously, we need to look at the whole architecture to say why so much dependence on one resource, like Mashira was saying, so that let's diversify, let's look at other streams of income, and then thirdly, let's interrogate the efficiency of public spending, because we need to see a connection between inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Butlale, and I think that is a very important note to leave it at. Thank you to Professor Emmanuel Butlale, Dr. Ross Barkley, Dr. Unalena Selulwane, and Menshila Khama for an hour and a half of engagement leading up to Botswana's elections on 30 October. I think no one can dispute the fact that Botswana is an important country, not just for SADC, but for the African continent. It's had a very good PR this year. Tebogo Letsile, a very good sports person, did so well at the Olympics and sort of brought Botswana's sporting prowess to the world. There's also the football teams that have done well. Running Galaxy, unfortunately, could not beat the best team on the continent, Orlando Pirates, but that's a story for another day. Just to wrap up, maybe some thank you to the people who've been participating in the chat: Gavin Craythorne, Nancy KG, Martin Changisa, Luatile Siboni, We've also had a few participants, Freddie Inambao, also Helen Epps, Siwai Santu. Thank you so much, Amanda Chetty. Thank you so much, Sharon Bailey, joining us from Cape Town in South Africa. Thank you, Gavin, also for saying many thanks to the guests. It's been a really engaging conversation with everyone here, and I really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you, and all the best to Botswana. Hopefully, it will be a free and fair elections. Looking forward to the outcomes, and praying that the democracy that we've seen Botswana maintain from 1966 doesn't continue in Botswana, but spreads across the African continent as well. I think we need that as a people. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.